4 hours before the federal government was set to end his life. Rafael Castellano asked for the one thing nobody at Rimfield Correctional expected a man like him to want. He didn't ask for a last meal, he didn't ask for a priest, and he didn't ask for a phone call to his lawyers. They called him the last true boss of the Atlantic City underworld, 34 years old, with silver already threading through his black hair, a faded scar above his left brow, and eyes the cold gray of winter seawater. And he looked at the warden through the bars and quietly said he wanted to see his dog, Duke, one last time. Warden Eleanor Boyd had spent 58 years learning not to be surprised by anything, 30 of them behind these walls. Yet something in that request made the old Army veteran go still. She'd read his file 100 times. She knew the headlines, the ones that painted him as a monster who'd killed the woman he loved, a young nurse named Marisol Reyes, who'd spent her nights healing the poor at a free clinic while he ran an empire of casinos and cargo docks. The whole country had already decided who he was, so had she. But there wasn't a trace of a monster in the way he said that dog's name. 40 minutes later, they walked him out into the yard, a slab of gray concrete pinned beneath a cold November sky, the salt wind rolling in off the Jersey coast. And past the fence, a black Bentley sat gleaming beside a knot of reporters, because the celebrated federal prosecutor who'd put him here, Gerald Whitlock, had come to deliver one last triumphant speech for the cameras. Then the gate groaned open, and an old cane corso limped in on a leash, his coat faded to the color of ash, one ear folded down, his front leg dragging from a wound 7 years old. Raphael dropped to his knees and opened his arms, and Duke stopped dead. The fur along his spine lifted, a low growl climbed out of his chest, and the dog didn't look at the master he hadn't seen in 7 years. He looked straight past him, right at the smiling man in the expensive suit by the gate. And in that single moment, everyone in the yard understood that this animal remembered something the courts had never known. What happened over the next 10 minutes would rip a 7-year lie wide open and break every heart watching. If this story moves you, take a second to hit that like button, share it with someone who still believes loyalty and truth matter, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that cold morning in the prison yard, where an old dog was about to reveal what no human ever could. That growl hung in the freezing air like a taut cord about to snap, and in that long, breathless moment, it seemed no one in the prison yard dared to move, not even the sea wind, which seemed to stop between the grim gray concrete walls. Raphael was still kneeling with both arms spread open and empty, his hands waiting for a familiar body to rush into them, the way he had imagined through 7 years of sleepless nights in his cell, but that embrace never came. And the only thing touching him now was the ice-cold confusion that moved through him when he realized Duke wasn't even looking at him. Slowly, he lowered his hands, his knees still pressed against the damp concrete, and his throat tightened around something he couldn't yet name. Because this dog, the dog that had once slept curled beneath his bed, the dog that had once licked his hand after the longest nights of his life, was now standing there with its entire body drawn tight like a bow pulled to its limit, its gaze pinned to some point behind him. Raphael rose slowly, his legs stiff after too many hours sitting in his cell, and he turned his head in the direction of the dog's stare, and only then did he understand who Duke was looking at. About 10 paces away, beyond the low fence that separated the yard from the outer walkway, Gerald Whitlock stood in a perfectly tailored gray suit, and on the face the television cameras had always loved, there still lingered the smile he had worn all morning. The smile of a man who had come to witness the crowning moment of his career. But something in that smile had just gone rigid, one corner of his mouth twitching slightly, and his pale blue eyes, which had always remained calm before the cameras, flickered over the dog with a flash of unease that only someone truly paying attention would have caught. The reporters behind him began to stir, the cameras that had been brought there to capture one clean, orderly moment of justice now all turning toward the growling dog, and the clicking of shutters rose in a frantic burst like hail striking a tin roof, mingling with murmurs of confusion from people who didn't understand what was happening in a prison yard that should have held only one cold, dreary procedure. Raphael stood motionless in the middle of it all, and inside his head a question rang with no answer, because Duke had never been a vicious dog, had never growled at strangers without cause. This was the dog Marisol had once joked was so gentle that if a burglar broke into the house, Duke would only wag his tail and invite him in, and yet now, from deep inside his chest came a low, heavy sound Raphael had heard only once before in his life, on the night he didn't allow himself to think about. In that heavy silence, a faint whisper first stirred years ago, in the deep, shadowed corners of Raphael's mind, rose again a formless instinct that Duke knew something, that he had been there that fateful night and had seen what no human being had seen. He had smothered that intuition for 7 years, knowing that hope was a dangerous luxury for a man facing execution. Yet now, standing in the yard with Duke's growl rumbling in his ears, he felt that hidden truth wake like a creature after a long sleep, refusing to be ignored any longer. Beside the dog, the young correctional officer assigned to escort Duke was gripping the leather leash so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and beads of sweat had gathered on his forehead, though the November morning was cold enough to cut skin, and his eyes kept darting toward Whitlock before quickly looking away again. A strange nervousness that didn't resemble the professional calm of the other officers standing around the yard. He swallowed hard, jerked the leash, and tried to hold the dog back, muttering an order in a trembling voice, but Duke barely moved at all 4 paws planted against the concrete as if every ounce of its weight and will were being driven in one single direction, and Warden Boyd, standing a few steps away with her hands clasped behind her back in the habit of an old soldier, slowly shifted her gaze from the dog to the young officer, then let it rest on his leash-gripping hand 1 beat longer than usual, her sharp, cold eyes narrowing slightly, and though she hadn't spoken a word, something in the scene had begun to brush against the instinct, sharpened, through 30 years behind bars in that woman, telling her that this morning wouldn't unfold the way anyone in the yard had expected. Gerald Whitlock had perhaps decided that this peculiar moment needed to be smothered with a show of calm composure, because he slipped a hand into his breast pocket and drew out a gleaming silver case, flicking the lid open with his thumb in the unhurried manner of a man who wanted every lens aimed at him to see that the growl of an old dog couldn't shake a man of his power. Then he took out a dark brown cigar, lifted it to his lips, and sparked the lighter, and the first breath of smoke curled into the freezing air as a faint blue ribbon drifting slowly across the yard. That smell, that sharply sweet, deeply pungent scent, belonging to a rare kind of leaf that only a handful of people in this city had the money and the taste to smoke, spread through the sea wind and slid toward the dog. And what happened next came so quickly that afterward no one in the yard could tell the story in quite the same way. Duke exploded. There was no waiting growl anymore, only a straightforward lunge with every last bit of strength left in its old body, and the leather leash slipped from the young correctional officer's sweaty hand, as if it had never been held at all. The officer stumbled forward with a frightened cry trapped in his throat, but it was already too late. The dog had crossed the yard in limping strides that were still astonishingly fast, and within an instant it was right in front of Whitlock. The crowd screamed. Several reporters staggered back. A camera fell onto the concrete and cracked open. But what made everyone freeze after that first burst of panic was that the dog didn't tear at him madly, like a rabid animal. It didn't aim for the man's throat or his face. Instead, its entire body drove toward one single point, Whitlock's right hand, the hand that had just lifted the cigar to his mouth. And Duke clamped down on that wrist, not grinding, not shaking, but holding it with a deliberate ferocity so chilling. It seemed as if for 7 years it had been waiting to seize that exact hand. Whitlock screamed, the cigar flying from his mouth and rolling across the concrete while still half lit, and he tried by instinct to wrench his hand free. But the dog held tight, and in the struggle, the sleeve of his gray suit jacket was dragged up past his wrist, revealing his clenched hand, and on the ring finger of that hand was a gold signet ring darkened with age, its face carved with an old crest that the pale November morning light caught for one brief instant. 2 other officers rushed in, slid their arms beneath the dog's belly, and pulled hard, and it took several seconds of effort before they managed to pry Duke away and pin it to the ground. The dog still didn't take its eyes off Whitlock, still growled low and deep in its throat, and its brown gaze burned with something no one in the yard could name. Whitlock staggered back several steps, clutching his wrist, his face bloodless, every trace of his television smile gone, and for those few brief seconds, the man who had remained calm before every camera for so many years revealed something far more naked, a primal fear flashing through the depths of his eyes before he managed to cover it with outrage. But Raphael didn't see that fear, because Raphael no longer saw anything except the ring, and the smell of cigar smoke still hanging in the air was sliding into his chest like a cold hand closing around his heart. That smell. He had smelled it somewhere before, a very long time ago. In a moment his mind had tried to bury for 7 years, because it was bound to the greatest pain of his life, and now it was rising from beneath the mud of memory, blurred but undeniable. That sharply sweet scent tangled with the image of a kitchen, tangled with the sickly yellow light of a hanging lamp, tangled with something he hadn't yet managed to piece into shape. And the ring, that crest carved into the gold face, he felt as if he had seen its imprint somewhere before, a faint mark pressed into flesh, some tiny detail that 7 years ago he had passed over in the stunned haze of loss, and never thought of again. His legs seemed to lift away from the earth, his ears rang. The chaos of the prison yard receded into a distant hum, and everything inside his head swayed, then suddenly settled into a terrifying stillness, the stillness of a man who had just seen one shard of truth flash in the darkness after all the years he hadn't allowed himself to believe. His lips moved, and from his dry throat came a sentence so small it almost vanished in the wind, a sentence no one stood close enough to hear in full, only the last few words escaping as breath. It can't be him. And then he fell silent, standing rooted in the middle of the yard, with his wide gray eyes fixed on the ringed hand of the man who had driven him to the edge of death. 7 years earlier, on a late autumn night, rain poured down over the coastal city, as if the sky were trying to wash away something that could never be cleansed, and Rafael Castellano drove home many hours later than he had promised Marisol. A meeting that dragged on at the harbor had kept him there. Those endless negotiations he could no longer remember a single word of now, and while he had sat among men from the underworld discussing things that no longer meant anything, she had been home alone. He remembered turning off his phone during the meeting, an old habit meant to keep anyone from disturbing him, and he remembered the vague sting of guilt when he turned it back on during the drive home, and saw the screen light up with a missed call from her. Only one call. But he had told himself he would apologize once he got home, that he would buy her the flowers she loved the next morning, that he would make it up to her as he had always promised and always been late to do. The seaside road lay empty beneath the curtain of rain, his headlights sweeping across shimmering puddles, and when he turned onto the narrow lane that led to their house, the first thing that made his heart tighten was the front door standing ajar. A dark, narrow gap spilling the sickly yellow light of the kitchen lamp that should have been off by then. He called her name from the threshold, his voice rising through the silent house and fading without an answer, and that silence was so heavy he felt it before he understood what had happened. He stepped into the kitchen, and there, beneath the hanging lamp casting down a cold circle of light, Rafael Castellano's world shattered into pieces that could never be put back together. Marisol was lying there, motionless, and in that moment everything he had once been, the powerful boss who made the whole city lower its voice in fear, the man who had never knelt before anyone, all of it collapsed, and he was only a stripped, bare human being, sinking down beside the woman he loved, calling her name again and again in a broken voice he didn't even recognize as his own. He didn't remember how long he knelt there, time frozen solid around him, with only the rain tapping on the roof and his own choked sobs echoing through the empty kitchen. And in the midst of that numb, blinding shock, one thing he would only become aware of much later was that Duke wasn't in the house. The dog that had always stayed close to Marisol, the dog that had never left her side for even half a step, had vanished. The back window of the kitchen stood wide open, and the soaked curtain flapped in the rain-lashed wind, as if something had leapt through that frame and into the darkness. He didn't have time to think about the dog, didn't have time to think about anything except the pain tearing him in two. And then came the red and blue lights flashing beyond the windows, the pounding footsteps, the hands pulling him to his feet, the questions hammering into his ears that he couldn't answer. It wasn't until nearly a full day later, when he was sitting in a cold interrogation room with his cuffed hands resting on a metal table, that Duke came home. They told him afterward that the dog dragged itself back to the porch at dawn, exhausted and trembling, one front leg almost unable to bear its weight, its fur matted with rain and with the wounds it carried on its body, and it collapsed onto the step as if it had spent the last drop of strength it had left finding its way home. But there was one detail that would haunt Raphael for many years afterward, whenever he allowed himself to remember it. And that was that, when Duke was found, the dog still had a torn piece of dark fabric clenched tightly between its teeth, a smooth and expensive cloth that didn't belong to anything in their house. More importantly, when the vet later cleaned the deep cuts around the exhausted animal's jaw, they discovered a small metal object deeply embedded in the wound near its back teeth, a hard little gold fragment that had snapped off and become violently wedged into the dog's gums during the struggle, and which no one bothered to examine all the way to the end. The police inventory back then had classified it as a broken fragment from the victim's own cheap jewelry, a deliberate misdirection forced into the files by Whitlock himself to ensure no independent goldsmith would ever examine the distinct family crest pattern. It remained a dead line among hundreds of others, locked away in the evidence vault, because to the public, the case built by the ambitious prosecutor had been all too clear. The man coming home late with a dark past, the dead woman, the wounded dog as a mute witness to the crime, all of it fitting together into a picture that the young ambitious prosecutor built before the court, with a ringing voice and eyes blazing with righteous fire. And Raphael, numbed by grief so deeply that he could hardly bring himself to defend his own life, had let them close the prison door behind him, carrying with him a question he hadn't had the strength to ask for 7 years. Where had Duke been that night, who had the dog chased into the rain, and where had that tiny piece of metal caught in its teeth truly come from? Marisol Reyes grew up in a poor neighborhood on the west side of Atlantic City, where old rows of houses crowded together beneath the glow of dazzling casinos that the people who lived there rarely had enough money to enter, and she lost her mother when she was too young to hold on to many memories, only enough to carry through life a vague emptiness and a deep understanding of what it meant to lose someone you needed beyond measure. Her mother had passed away after a long illness the family couldn't afford to treat properly, and perhaps it was from those long nights sitting beside her mother's sickbed, watching unfamiliar hands in white uniforms care for the person she loved most in the world, that a seed quietly took root inside little Marisol. The idea that there was a profession in this life where people gave their whole lives to easing the pain of others. She grew up under the difficult shelter of a father who worked himself to the bone, and in a neighborhood where everyone lacked something, but still shared what little they had. And perhaps it was that which taught her that kindness wasn't a luxury, reserved only for people who had plenty, but something the poorer one became, the more fiercely one had to hold on to it, the way one held on to warmth on a winter night. When she became an adult, she didn't choose an easier road to leave that neighborhood behind, but returned to the very place where she had been born, put on a nurse's uniform, and took the night shift at a free community clinic tucked among streets that ambulances often hesitated to enter after dark. There, she bandaged people the rest of the city preferred to look away from, workers injured on the job who didn't dare go to the hospital for fear of the bill, old people with no children, young men who had lost their way and carried wounds on their bodies they would never explain, and Marisol never asked where they had come from or what they had done to earn those wounds, because to her, a person in pain was a person who needed help, and that alone was enough. It was during one of those night shifts, many years ago, when the first rain of the season was tapping against the clinic's fogged glass window, and the whole neighborhood had fallen into an exhausted sleep, that a man staggered across the threshold, with one hand pressed hard against his ribs and dark drops falling onto the old tile floor. He was tall and powerfully built, dressed with a kind of elegance that looked out of place in that shabby room, his face pale from blood loss, while his gray eyes still held the cold wariness of someone used to living in danger. And he didn't give his name, only asked in a hoarse voice that she not call the police. Anyone else would have been perceptive enough to understand who this man was, to realize that the wound hadn't come from any ordinary accident, and to feel fear creeping into the heart. But Marisol only looked at him for a moment, then quietly pulled him to the examination bed, cut away the soaked fabric of his shirt, and began the work she had done thousands of times before, her hands steady and gentle, never trembling once. While she cleaned and stitched the wound beneath the sickly yellow light, the man watched her with a curiosity he couldn't quite understand, and at last he asked, his voice still weak, whether she knew who she was helping, whether she truly wanted to get involved with a man like him. Marisol paused for a second, looked straight into those gray eyes, and told him in a calm but firm voice that in this place she didn't bandage a person's record, she bandaged the person himself, that his name and his past were matters between him and his conscience, while her duty was only to help a bleeding life stop bleeding, and to her, every wound was equal beneath the roof of that clinic. Those words, so simple they almost seemed unremarkable, touched something deep inside Rafael Castellano. A man who had spent his whole life being seen only through the fear he planted in others, through power and sin, and the dark title the city had placed upon him. And now, for the first time in many years, someone looked at him and didn't see the boss, didn't see the monster, only saw a human being who needed to be healed. He left the clinic that night with a neat row of stitches in his side and something unfamiliar kindling in his chest, a small light he didn't yet dare to name, and he told himself he would never come back, that a man like him had no right to drag such a pure soul into his dark world. But he did come back, again and again, at first using small excuses and later needing no excuse at all, and her words about healing the person instead of healing the record kept echoing in his mind like a gentle, persistent reminder of the man he might have become, the man only she could see hidden beneath the shell the rest of the world had decided was all he was. Gerald Whitlock was the face America had learned to trust. A federal prosecutor the press fondly called the knight fighting the Mafia, the man standing at the front line of the war, against the underground empires draining the coastal cities dry, and for more than a decade he had built the image of a man so upright he couldn't be bought, so devoted he had no regard for himself. A model law schools held up as an example, and politicians longed to stand beside in the same frame. He had everything needed for the public to love him. A clean, handsome face with blonde hair always combed neatly into place, delicate silver-framed glasses that gave him the air of a trustworthy intellectual, and above all, the smile, that smile practiced to perfection before the lens, warm enough for people to feel close to him, yet stern enough for them to feel reassured that justice rested in steady hands. The case that had sent Rafael Castellano to prison 7 years earlier had been the finest jewel in the crown of his career. The conviction that turned a well-known prosecutor into a living legend, the man who had brought down the last boss of Atlantic City, the man who had done what so many before him had only dared to dream of, and from then on the name Whitlock became bound to the idea of justice without mercy, a symbol of the belief that no matter how powerful the wicked became, in the end they still had to kneel before the law. For that reason, his presence at Rimfield Prison on this fateful morning struck no one as strange. On the contrary, it was seen as a complete ending to a long story, and he had skillfully turned his appearance into an event, calling the press to gather outside the prison gate early, arranging a brief encounter with the media that outwardly looked like the gesture of a representative of justice wishing to close the final chapter with a few solemn words. He stood before the microphones pointed toward him, adjusted his glasses with a gesture that had become his trademark, and spoke to the public in his familiar, deep, warm voice about the meaning of this day, about a dark chapter of the city finally being closed, about the promise that no one stood above the law, and the listeners nodded. The reporters wrote, and not one of them so much as suspected that behind that calm smile was a mind calculating every remaining minute of this morning with cold urgency. Because what no reporter knew, what even Warden Boyd hadn't yet imagined as she stood watching him from inside the yard, was that tonight, immediately after the procedure at Rimfield was complete, and the cameras had gone dark, Gerald Whitlock wouldn't return to his luxurious apartment in the city, but would quietly go straight to the airport, where a ticket had already been booked for a journey very far away, with no return date. For many months, he had been silently preparing for this day, placing money where no one could reach it, gradually cutting away the ties that bound him to this city, and he had chosen this very morning as his point of departure, because in his calculation, once Rafael Castellano was gone, the last dangerous piece of a secret that had lasted 7 years would be buried forever with him, and he would calmly board that flight like a hero who had just completed the noblest mission of his life, leaving behind a grateful city and a truth that would never be spoken. That was exactly why, even though the whole prison yard was now reeling from the mad act of an old dog, even though his wrist still throbbed beneath the sleeve of his suit, Whitlock was still trying with all his strength to hold on to his composure and pull the situation back under control, because he couldn't let anything, no matter how small, throw off the plan he had built with such care. And inside his head at that moment there was only one thought, pounding like a clock running backward, that he needed this morning to end quickly, needed that dog dragged away, needed the final door to close exactly as planned, so that by the time night fell he would be far from this place, safely beyond the reach of a truth he had believed he had controlled for the past 7 years. Rafael Castellano heard his own voice ringing out across the prison yard before he was even aware that he was speaking, and the words poured out from somewhere deeper than fear or despair, from a place where 7 years of silence had just split wide open. With a voice trembling but gaining dangerous strength, Rafael pointed directly at the trembling prosecutor. He declared to the entire yard that the sharply sweet cigar smoke and the gold signet ring had finally unlocked his buried memories of that fateful night. He demanded to know why that exact scent had lingered in his kitchen when Marisol hated smoke, and why a faint imprint of that very crest had been left at the crime scene, a detail the courts had ignored, but his dog had clearly never forgotten. For one moment, the whole yard sank into a thick, clotted silence, with only the sea wind hissing through the fence, and the rough breathing of the dog still pinned to the ground, and every pair of eyes, every reporter, every officer, turned toward the prosecutor standing there with his aching wrist. Then Whitlock laughed, a dry laugh he forced out as though it were perfectly natural, and he adjusted his silver-framed glasses with his uninjured hand, reclaiming the calm composure he had polished through so many years before the cameras. He said in that familiar, deep, warm voice, the voice that had persuaded so many juries, that this was the saddest thing he had ever witnessed, that when a man came close enough to death, he would cling to any illusion to escape the truth of what he had done, that the words just spoken were nothing more than the delirium of a desperate man, trying to build a wild story from the smell of a cigar and the unstable reaction of an old dog far past its prime. He turned toward the reporters, opened his hands slightly in a gesture that was both sympathetic and weary, and said that the poor animal had surely been driven into panic by 7 years of confinement and old age, that no one should build anything upon the growls of a beast, and that the only humane thing now was to let this morning end in order, as it was meant to. His words were smooth and convincing, and a few reporters had already begun to nod, a few pens dipping back down to their notebooks, the air seeming to tilt once more toward the powerful man, because after all, who would believe the words of a condemned prisoner against the word of a symbol of justice? But there was one person in the yard who didn't nod, didn't write, didn't get swept along by that silken voice, and that was Warden Eleanor Boyd. 30 years behind bars had taught her something no school ever could, how to tell the difference between a man inventing a story and a man who had just struck a terrible truth. And in Rafael Castellano's eyes at that moment, she didn't see the cunning of a liar, but the naked shock of someone who had just been strangled by memory. She didn't answer Whitlock, and she didn't look toward the reporters. Instead, her sharp, cold eyes slowly lowered, passing over the prosecutor's smiling face, down his shoulder, down his arm, and stopping at his right hand, the hand whose sleeve was still dragged out of place by the dog, exposing a strip of wrist where the darkened gold signet ring quietly caught a faint glimmer beneath the November sky. She looked at that ring, then at the way Whitlock's fingers were curling slightly, as if he wanted to hide it in his palm, and something in that posture, in that tiny, almost unconscious movement, made the seasoned woman suddenly go still. She said nothing at all, her face keeping its usual cold and composed expression, but beneath that shell, a vague warning bell had just begun to ring, and her gaze lingered on that ringed hand, 1 beat longer than an ordinary glance should have allowed, long enough for a question to begin forming inside her, one she wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. In a hidden corner of the yard, standing among a few officials permitted to witness this morning, there was a young man no one had paid any attention to until now, a man of about 22 with a thin frame and a face marked by years of hardship, his deep, dark eyes carrying a grief far older than his age. Danny Reyes had requested permission to be here weeks earlier, had filled out the forms, had waited and pleaded, and everyone who reviewed that request believed they understood the reason, that the victim's only younger brother wanted to see with his own eyes the man who had taken his sister from him pay the price. wanted to close 7 years of pain by watching the final door shut. None of them knew the truth buried deep in his heart, the truth he had carried here like a stone pressing on his chest every day, and he had stood there all morning in silence, both hands clenched inside the pockets of his old coat, his eyes fixed on the concrete, trying not to look toward the man the whole city believed was the killer. But when the dog lunged and the entire yard erupted into chaos, when Whitlock's sleeve was dragged out of place, and the darkened gold signet ring appeared beneath the pale light, Danny looked up, and in that instant, his whole body seemed to turn to stone. He stared at the ring, at the old crest carved into the face of the gold, and something deep inside his memory woke with a force that almost stole his breath, because he had seen that ring before, had seen it on a man's hand, on a night he had spent 7 years trying and failing to forget. Memory crashed back without mercy, sharp to the point of cruelty, that rainy night, when he had gone to his sister's house in the worst state of his life. A young man sinking deep into the mistakes his sister had always tried to pull him out of, and he had stood hidden in the darkness across the street, hesitating and too ashamed of himself to knock, when he saw a man step out of his sister's house, a finely dressed man walking in a hurry, and beneath the dim streetlight, when that hand rose to adjust his collar, the gold of a large ring flashed. Back then, he hadn't understood what he had just witnessed. He had only thought it was some guest of his sister's. And it wasn't until the next morning, when the terrible news struck and his whole world collapsed, that he began putting the pieces together, began realizing that the man with the ring had left the house at the very hour of fate. He had tried to say it. He had tried to tell the police about the man in the ring, but his statement had been brushed aside with cold and calculated ease, because at that exact time Danny himself was in the sights of a drug investigation, an investigation he didn't know, had been directed and pushed from above by the very ambitious prosecutor building the case against Raphael. They looked at him and saw only a troubled young man whose mind could no longer be trusted, a witness with no value at all, his words written down carelessly and buried in a corner of the file no one bothered to open again, and Danny, young and shattered, hadn't had the strength to fight an entire machine moving smoothly toward a conclusion already chosen. For the 7 years that followed, Danny lived with the torment of a man carrying a shard of truth no one would listen to, a fragment he slowly began to doubt himself, wondering whether it had been real or only an illusion created by grief and by the poisons that had once moved through his body in those days. And he had told himself that perhaps he had been wrong, that perhaps the man they convicted really had been the one who caused it all, because believing that was still easier than living with the thought that the real killer remained free somewhere out there, while he stood powerless to do anything. But now, standing in the yard at Rimfield Prison on this freezing morning, seeing that ring appear before his eyes for the second time in his life after 7 long years, Danny felt the ground sway beneath his feet, because he knew with no doubt left at all, that this was the ring, this was the hand, and that the fragment of truth he had buried in shame and despair all those years had never been an illusion. His lips parted, his breath coming fast, and he took one unsteady step forward, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling Warden Boyd's gaze sweep toward him. As she noticed the unusual movement of the young man who had been standing silently in the corner all this time, and he understood that the moment he had both run from and longed for through 7 years had finally come, Danny Reyes took another step toward the center of the yard, and when his voice rose, it was hoarse and trembling, but loud enough to cut through the wind. He said he had something he needed to tell, something he had tried to say 7 years ago, but no one had been willing to listen. Every eye in the yard turned toward the thin young man no one had paid attention to until now, and Warden Boyd lifted one hand slightly, signaling the officers to hold their positions and allowing him to speak, because she had recognized in his posture the weight of a person finally setting down a burden that had pressed on his shoulders far too long. Danny said he was Marisol's younger brother, and that name alone, leaving his mouth, made his voice sink lower. He said she had been everything he had in this world after their mother died, the only person who had never given up on him, even in the darkest days when he had given up on himself. In broken, halting phrases, Danny spoke of the dark years when he had completely lost himself to bad choices. He confessed that when everyone else had given up on him, Marisol was the only one who refused to leave him in the dark, using everything she had to pull him back from the edge. Her final words to him still echoed in his mind, a reminder of a bond that not even death could break. And because of her, only because of her, he had slowly dragged himself out of that abyss, had found again one piece of the man he had once lost. And the cruelest thing, the thing he could never forgive fate for, was that she had been stolen from this life, at the very moment he had only just begun to stand steady again, because of the hand she had held out to him. Then Danny spoke of something no one had ever heard, the shard of memory he had kept to himself for 7 years, because it was too painful to touch, that on that very fateful night, his sister had called him. His phone had rung in the dark, her name had appeared on the screen, and when he answered, her voice wasn't the gentle voice he knew every day, but a tense and hurried voice, a voice trying to hold back fear. She asked where he was, her voice urgent, and she said there's something she needed to tell him, something important and dangerous that she had just discovered. She told him to come to her at once, that she needed him, that she couldn't trust anyone else enough to call at that moment. But Danny of 7 years ago, the young man still staggering along the road back to himself, had hesitated, had delayed, had told her he would come but couldn't leave right away, and he had hung up with the promise that he would be there soon. Moments later, his phone rang a second time, but caught up in his stubborn hesitation, he didn't answer it, letting it go to voicemail, never knowing that while he ignored the ringing, her time was draining away minute by minute, and that her second, unanswered call would capture the final, terrifying moments of her life. When he finally dragged himself to her house that night, hiding in the darkness across the street with shame because he had arrived too late, he only had time to see the man with the ring walking out, and he had stood there paralyzed, not understanding, not knowing that behind that door everything had changed forever. Danny's voice broke when he reached that part, and he confessed that for 7 years he had tortured himself with the thought that if only he had gone the moment she called, if only he hadn't hesitated, if only he had been there in time, maybe she would still be alive, and that burden had pressed down on him every day until this very morning. But now, seeing the ring on that man's hand, he understood that the call that night hadn't been a meaningless cry for help, but his sister trying to tell him something, a truth she had just uncovered and had paid for, with her life. Danny, trembling, slipped a hand into his coat pocket and took out an old phone, its screen cracked in a line across one corner, and he said in a choked voice that he had kept it for 7 years, not the phone he used every day, but this old device, which he had set aside the way people preserved a relic, because inside it was the last precious thing left of his sister. He explained that on that night, after he hung up on her first call, she had immediately tried to call him back. Since he didn't pick up, she was forced to leave a desperate voicemail. On that chaotic night, in his panicked rush to her house, Danny had dropped the phone into a deep puddle of rainwater, causing the device to short-circuit and rendering the audio file completely corrupted. 7 years ago, the police technicians dismissed it as an unrecoverable, distorted mess of static, burying it away. But Danny could never let it go. He preserved the damaged device like a relic, and only weeks ago, utilizing modern digital audio restoration technology that didn't exist back then, he finally managed to clean through the static and fully reconstruct the fateful voicemail his sister had left, because every time he touched this phone, he had to face the loss and guilt that tore at him. But he had never let it disappear. He had carefully kept it charged, had carried it with him through every place where he had ever taken shelter, and now he held it out before Warden Boyd, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Boyd stepped forward and took the phone with a solemn gesture, understanding she was holding a fragment of truth that had taken 7 long years of technological advancement to unlock. After a moment of hesitation, she looked around the yard that had fallen completely silent, then pressed the button, letting the newly restored, crystal-clear recording play through the external speaker for everyone to hear. For the first few seconds, there was only the static of an old recording and a faint rustling sound. Then a voice rose in the middle of the prison yard, and that voice, clear and gentle even in its tension, made Rafael Castellanos' entire world come to a halt. It was Marisol's voice. After 7 years, 7 years in which he had only heard her voice in dreams that grew more faded each time. 7 years lying in his cell, trying to hold on to that sound in his memory, while still feeling it slip away little by little. Her voice now suddenly came alive in the middle of this cold concrete yard, so real that he felt if he only turned his head, he would see her standing there. His knees gave way, and he couldn't hold himself together anymore. The tears he had swallowed back for 7 years now rolled down the hollow face of the man who had once made the whole city tremble, and he lifted one shaking hand to cover his mouth, as if to hold back the sob breaking out of him, his gray eyes fixed on the phone in Boyd's hand as if it were her face. In the recording, Marisol's voice was hurried and lowered, as if she were speaking quickly from some hidden corner. She said she was sorry for calling so late, that she had just discovered something terrible and couldn't keep it to herself. She said she had seen something she should never have seen, had learned something about dirty money, being passed through the shadows, envelopes of cash delivered to someone everyone trusted, someone standing in a position so high that no one would dare suspect him. Her voice caught. She said she was afraid, that she knew she was holding something dangerous. But she couldn't stay silent because innocent people had already suffered because of that network. And then she began to say a name, her voice dropping almost to a whisper as she spoke the first syllable of that man's name, and the entire yard held its breath around the small speaker, every person straining to hear the full name about to be spoken. But at that very instant, Marisol's voice suddenly stopped halfway. A vague sound rose in the recording, something like a door, like an unexpected presence, and her voice changed at once, the fear in it rising into something sharp and immediate. She only had time to utter one single word, a word that slipped out softly, full of shock and terror, as if she had just realized someone was standing right behind her. And then the recording stopped dead, cutting into a deathly silence. And in that silence, the entire yard at Rimfield Prison seemed to stop breathing. Not a sound, not a breath, only the sea wind hissing through the steel fence, and Raphael's strangled sobs as he knelt collapsed on the concrete. Because the final word Marisol had spoken before everything sank into silence, the word that had rung out and then vanished in the yard, had left every person there stunned and slowly, without anyone telling them to, turning their heads in one single direction. The word Marisol had spoken before the recording went dead, still hung in the freezing air like a blade that had not yet fallen, and the eyes of everyone in the yard, without anyone telling them to, fixed on Gerald Whitlock, the man standing there with every trace of color drained from his face beneath the November sky. But in that crucial moment, when all attention rushed toward the prosecutor, Warden Boyd was the only one who didn't look at him, because, with the instinct forged through 30 years, her sharp, cold gaze had already slid in another direction, toward the young correctional officer still standing near the dog, the one whose strange nervousness she had dimly noticed since the beginning of the morning. The young man was now deathly pale, sweat breaking across his forehead, despite the skin-cutting cold. His eyes darting again and again toward Whitlock before quickly looking away, and when he saw the entire yard shifting in a direction he hadn't expected, his hands began to tremble and his fingers clenched together unconsciously. Boyd took one slow step toward him, her voice calm and cold as steel as she asked him why he had been looking toward the prosecutor all morning, why his hand had shaken so badly that he had let the leash slip when the dog lunged, and whether there was anything he wanted to tell her right now. The young officer opened his mouth but couldn't get a word out, his throat closing, and that panicked silence, that very way he couldn't bring himself to look straight into her eyes, said more than any confession could have. Under Boyd's piercing stare and before an entire yard of witnesses, he finally broke, stammering as he admitted that Whitlock's people had approached him several days earlier, that they had paid him a sum of money just to do what seemed like one harmless thing, to stay close to the condemned man during his final hours and report immediately if Raphael said anything unusual, any name, any accusation aimed at the prosecutor. He said he didn't know why Whitlock was so afraid of the words of a man about to die, that he had only thought it was the caution of a powerful man who wanted everything to go smoothly. And he had accepted because that money was too large compared with his wages, but because he had spent the whole morning anxiously watching and listening, because of the clumsiness of a guilty man who startled at his own shadow. When the dog suddenly lunged, his sweaty hand hadn't been able to hold the leash. That confession crashed down over the yard like thunder, because it exposed a simple truth that couldn't be denied, that an innocent man, a symbol of justice at the height of glory, had no reason to pay someone to monitor the last words of the prisoner he himself had sent to prison. Only a man hiding something would have reason to be that afraid. Whitlock understood that the situation was slipping out of his hands, and he changed tactics at once, his face hardening as he stepped in front of Boyd and lowered his voice into a cold threat. He reminded her who he was, reminded her that he was a federal prosecutor with connections reaching into the highest corridors of power, that a single phone call from him could turn her 30-year career to smoke, that she should think very carefully before letting a mad dog and the lies of a condemned prisoner and a junkie ruin this morning and drag her down into the mud with them. But Eleanor Boyd didn't even blink. She had faced men far more dangerous than Whitlock throughout her life, and she only moved her eyes quietly toward the fence where the reporters stood, the very people Whitlock himself had invited to record his moment of glory. And now all those cameras were pointed straight at him, red lights blinking, capturing every word and every gesture, turning the threat he had just made into living evidence before the eyes of the public. Boyd turned back and looked directly into his eyes, and in the steady voice of a woman who had never stepped back, she declared that from this moment on, no one was leaving this yard, that she was exercising her authority as the head of the prison to suspend all procedures until everything had been brought into the light, and that if the prosecutor wanted to talk about power and consequences, he was welcome to do it. But he could do it in front of the cameras, so the whole country could hear. As the yard gradually settled after Warden Boyd's decisive declaration, one question began to hang in the minds of everyone present, and that was how Marisol Reyes, a night shift nurse at a poor clinic, could have touched a secret so dangerous, a secret powerful enough to make a federal prosecutor tremble in fear for 7 long years. The answer was as simple as it was tragic. Marisol hadn't sought out the conspiracy. It had found her at the clinic. Through the broken words of injured patients from the neighborhood shadows, she slowly pieced together the network of dirty money that Whitlock was protecting. Driven by her unyielding conscience, she meticulously documented every name, date, and transaction into her leather notebook, stepping into a trap that would ultimately cost her life. She had seen with her own eyes, by one cruel accident of fate that placed her in the right place at the right time, an exchange taking place in the darkness near the clinic. A thick envelope passed from one hand to another, and she had recognized the face of the man receiving it, the face all of America still saw on television as a symbol of integrity. And in that moment, her vague suspicions became a concrete and terrifying truth she could no longer deny. Marisol understood all too well the danger of what she was holding. She knew that for a small woman with no power and no protection to stand against someone that powerful was no different from throwing an egg at a stone. But she also couldn't live peacefully with silence, because she had seen innocent people crushed beneath that network with her own eyes, had bandaged wounds no one should ever have had to bear, and the conscience of a person who had chosen to spend her whole life easing the pain of others wouldn't allow her to look away. And so she kept writing things down, kept gathering pieces quietly and steadfastly, nurturing the intention of bringing everything she knew into the light when the time was right, believing with a naive and noble faith that truth would win in the end, that if she did what was right, if she was brave, then justice would stand with the suffering people she had always protected, never knowing that her very courage and kindness, that dignity in her which refused to bow before evil, would place her directly in the sights of a man willing to do anything to protect the mask he had worn his entire life. Raphael was still kneeling on the damp concrete when he spoke, and his voice now was no longer the voice of a boss or a condemned prisoner, but only the voice of a man trying to explain something that had tormented him for a very long time. He told Boyd, told Danny, told everyone standing there in silence, that he needed them to understand one thing, that when he had asked to see Duke that morning, he hadn't calculated anything. But then he confessed one more thing, softly and haltingly, pointing back to the fateful night when the dog had returned home wounded, with that strange piece of fabric in its teeth. He admitted that for 7 long years, he had been tortured by the silent, agonizing hope that Duke had witnessed the truth. It was an idea he had desperately tried to suppress, believing it was too wild to trust, yet a tiny, unspoken part of him had secretly clung to the possibility that the animal's memory might one day speak. But he insisted, with all the sincerity he had left, that it had never been a plan, that he had stepped into the yard that morning, with the heart of a man coming to say farewell. not with the mind of someone laying a trap, and that what had just happened had stunned him no less than anyone standing there. That explanation fell into the quieted yard, and something in its naked sincerity made even the skeptical reporters soften, because the man kneeling there no longer carried any trace of the monster they had once believed in, only a broken human being laying his heart bare in broad daylight. And it was in that silent, deeply moving moment, when every bit of attention was fixed on Raphael and the words he had just spoken, that Duke, the dog still being held down on the concrete by two officers, suddenly shifted. It was no longer looking toward Whitlock. Its old ears lifted, its wet nose tilted into the air, and it began sniffing rapidly and urgently, as if it had just caught a trace that until now had been hidden beneath the smell of smoke and people, and its whole body tightened in a completely new direction. Then, with a sudden burst of strength from that old weakened body, a strength no one thought it could still possess, the dog jerked hard and tore free from the hands holding it down. The officers only had time to lurch forward and grab at empty air, and Duke shot away, not toward the prosecutor as everyone expected, not toward its master, but straight across the yard along a path none of the people standing there could have foreseen, heading directly toward the fence, toward the gate, toward the place where Gerald Whitlock's glossy black Bentley sat quietly parked beneath the gray November sky. The glossy black Bentley, parked quietly beyond the fence, suddenly became the center of attention, as the old dog rushed toward it and began clawing wildly at the rear trunk lid, its front paws striking again and again against the polished paint, its nose pushing into the seam of the trunk as it sniffed frantically, its throat giving off a rush of sharp whimpers mixed with growls. A desperate urgency, as if there were something inside that compartment it had to reach no matter what. The entire prison yard froze at the sight, and Warden Boyd's eyes instantly shifted from the dog to Gerald Whitlock's face, and she caught the exact moment when every last trace of composure vanished from the prosecutor's expression, replaced by naked panic as he hurried one step toward the car, then stopped short, realizing that every camera was still pointed at him. Boyd didn't miss that reaction, and in a voice of steel that allowed no argument, she ordered the trunk opened immediately. Whitlock objected at once, his voice rising unnaturally as he said this was his personal property, that no one had the right to search his car without a warrant, that she was exceeding the authority of a prison warden, and would pay dearly for this action. But his words had lost the weight they once carried. They sounded like the thrashing of a man losing his footing. Boyd only replied that the car was parked on land under the control of the prison she commanded, that an animal had just shown an abnormal reaction to this vehicle in the middle of an urgent investigation, and that if there was nothing inside to hide, he had no reason to fear a trunk being opened before the eyes of the public. She signaled to the officers, and before the breathless reporters, Whitlock was forced to hand over the key. His hand trembled as he pressed the button, and the trunk lid slowly rose with a soft mechanical hum. Inside was an expensive leather suitcase packed with care, and when the officers opened it under the daylight, what appeared made the yard fall silent once more, because inside was not the luggage of a man preparing to go home after a morning's work, but the carefully arranged belongings of someone preparing to leave with no intention of returning: neatly folded clothing, bundles of cash tied with care, a passport, and tucked inside that passport was a plane ticket. Boyd picked up the ticket and glanced over it, then raised her eyes and looked straight at Whitlock, because it was a ticket for a flight leaving that very night, a one-way flight to a faraway country across the ocean, a place she understood all too well had no extradition treaty with America. Whitlock tried to salvage the situation, his voice straining to recover its calm as he said he had simply planned a long vacation after closing the greatest case of his life, that after so many years of tireless service he deserved to rest, that it was an entirely private matter, and had nothing to do with the absurd accusations unfolding here. But even the reporters who had once admired him were now looking at one another with suspicion, because no one going on vacation carried that much cash and a one-way ticket to a place beyond the reach of their own country's law, and the excuse he offered was so thin that his own voice betrayed it. While all attention was fixed on the ticket and the passport, the dog still hadn't stopped. It slipped between the officer's legs and climbed fully into the trunk, its old nose searching along the side of the suitcase until it stopped at a small outer pocket, and with a certainty that makes everyone hold their breath, Duke clamped its teeth onto the leather of that pocket and yanked hard, tearing the zipper open. From inside, it dragged out a faded woolen knitted scarf, the very one Marisol had worn on that rainy night, now heavily permeated with the sweet, pungent scent of Whitlock's rare cigars that shared the same luggage space. Along with the fabric, a worn leather-bound notebook tumbled out onto the concrete yard. It was a sick trophy, a sentimental piece of fabric, and a dangerous record the prosecutor had kept to feed his dark, twisted obsession. Danny choked on a sob the moment he saw it, recognizing the hand-embroidered initials. M.R. on the corner of the fabric. Warden Boyd bent down and picked up the worn, leather-bound notebook from the concrete, lifting it with both hands with a respect that was almost reverent, and she slowly turned through the pages before the tense eyes of the entire yard. Inside were the neat lines of a hand accustomed to taking notes, the orderly and careful handwriting of a nurse, used to recording every detail of a patient's chart, and what appeared on those pages made her face harden with every line she read. It wasn't a sentimental diary, but a meticulous and systematic record kept by a person quietly rebuilding a truth from fragments. Day after day, Marisol had written down what she heard, the names, the places, the sums of money, the exchanges made in the dark, and above all, every time the name of the man at the head of that network had been mentioned, the name she had carefully checked and written down until there was no room left for doubt. Boyd looked up at Whitlock, her voice cold as ice. She asked how the personal woolen scarf of a murdered woman, missing from the crime scene for 7 years, had ended up hidden inside the private luggage of the federal prosecutor. Whitlock stood there, his face bloodless, his quick, calculating mind scrambled for a lie, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were meaningless, because real evidence belonged in the court archive, not in the side pocket of a suitcase belonging to a man about to board a one-way flight. Cornered, he blurted out a truth even more dangerous to himself. In a dry, shattered voice, Whitlock finally confessed to his dark reality. He hadn't kept a notebook of evidence. He had kept a trophy of his obsession. He admitted that after framing Raphael, his twisted mind couldn't let go of the only woman who had ever rejected him. He had taken her scarf from the house that night, keeping it locked away like a prize alongside his personal belongings, never realizing that the thick woolen fabric would deeply absorb and lock in years of his signature cigar smoke, creating a permanent, fatal scent trap waiting for an old dog's memory. Somewhere no American investigative agency could ever trace it, because he believed that once Raphael was gone, this would be the last piece of evidence that could expose him, and he wanted it to disappear forever along with his departure. That involuntary confession made his own face go pale when he realized what he had just said in front of dozens of cameras, but it was already too late to take it back, and while the whole yard was still shaken, Warden Boyd moved on to another connection, another piece of the puzzle that had just fallen into place in her mind. She turned to the officers and ordered them to call up at once the old case file for Rafael Castellano. The evidence inventory made 7 years earlier on that fateful night, and when the original forensic low-resolution photo of the evidence was pulled up on the screen, the truth stripped away Whitlock's final defense. The dry notation stating it was, the victim's jewelry was exposed as a blatant forgery, under the light of everything just revealed. That small gold fragment, with its microscopic jagged edge, recorded in the vault, matched with terrifying precision the broken link and chipped crest on Whitlock's ring. The hound had literally bitten the signature of the killer right off his hand 7 years ago. A piece of truth the prosecutor thought he had buried under altered paperwork forever. Because Boyd lowered her gaze to the signet ring on Whitlock's hand, the darkened gold face carved with an old crest, and she recognized at once that at one corner of that ring face there was a small defect, a broken link, a chip where the gold looked newer and smoother than the rest, as if a piece had been snapped off long ago. The metal fragment caught in Duke's teeth 7 years earlier had never been Marisol's jewelry. It was a broken piece from the killer's own ring, bitten off by the dog during the struggle that night when it had lunged in to protect her. And through 7 long years, that unmistakable evidence had lain silent in the court's evidence storage, mislabeled, forgotten, only one line away from the truth, a line no one had been willing to read correctly. Danny broke down sobbing when he understood it, while Raphael's head snapped up, his gray eyes widening as all 7 years of wrongful suffering, All 7 years of blaming himself because he hadn't saved her suddenly shifted in one dizzying moment, because the dog he had come to say goodbye to for the last time had in fact been carrying the proof of his innocence from that terrible night, proof that an entire justice system had turned its face away from. The newly uncovered evidence now stood as an undeniable wall of truth before everyone present in the yard. From Marisol's recovered notebook to Whitlock's own damning confession, the pieces of the 7-year-old puzzle had finally locked together with terrifying precision, leaving no room for excuses. Warden Boyd stood straight in the center of the yard, and with the cold authority that had followed her through her military life and 30 years behind bars, she declared in a clear voice that, as the head of Rimfield Prison, she was officially ordering an immediate stay of execution for Rafael Castellano, that in the face of newly emerged evidence, shaking the very foundation of the conviction, she couldn't and wouldn't allow the justice system to take a human life, when the truth had just revealed the horrifying possibility of a wrongful judgment. That declaration rang out like a bell of deliverance, and somewhere inside the prison, the cold machine that had been counting down minute by minute toward the hour of execution suddenly came to a halt, the death clock that had hung over Raphael's head all morning like a scythe now stopping in place. Then Boyd took out her phone, and right in front of the reporters recording every moment, she made call after call, the first to the U.S. Department of Justice to report the new developments and request that the case be reopened urgently, the second to the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because what Marisol's notebook exposed, a dirty money network aided by a federal prosecutor, had gone far beyond state authority and reached a level only the federal government could handle. She spoke briefly, clearly, every sentence and every word weighed with care, because she knew they were being recorded, and she requested that agents be sent to Rimfield immediately, while also ordering her officers to detain Gerald Whitlock on site and not allow him to leave the yard until the proper authorities arrived. Whitlock began to resist, his voice cracking out of the last remains of calm, shouting about authority, about lawyers, about his powerful connections. But those words were now only the hollow echoes of a wall collapsing, and even the reporters who had once lifted him into the realm of symbols now stepped back from him, as if stepping away from something whose true form had just been revealed. Raphael was still kneeling on the concrete, and when he heard the words "stay of execution," his whole body trembled, not from joy, because his mind was still too numb to feel happiness, but from an overwhelming sensation he couldn't name as 7 years of waiting for death suddenly turned in a direction he had never dared imagine, and he looked for Duke, the dog that had now stopped growling and was standing there panting, its old body trembling with exhaustion, while its brown eyes still shone with something calm, as if it had just completed a mission it had carried inside itself for the rest of its life. The entire yard seemed to release an invisible burden, the tension in the air beginning to sink into a new kind of waiting, and Boyd lowered her phone, her eyes sweeping once across the yard as if making certain everything was under control, her face showing, for the first time that morning, something almost like relief. But it was in that very instant, when everything seemed to have just settled, that the phone in her hand suddenly rang, a shrill sound cutting through the fragile silence that had only just formed, and she lifted it to her ear, identifying herself in her usual clear voice. But after only a few seconds of listening to the voice on the other end, all the blood seemed to drain from her face. Her fingers tightened around the phone, and the iron composure she had held through the entire turbulent morning suddenly cracked when the brief sentence from the other end poured into her ear. Something that even a woman who had lived through every kind of storm could never have foreseen. The short sentence that had just poured into Warden Boyd's ear through the phone, though no one in the yard yet knew what it was, made her stand motionless for a moment. But that seasoned woman quickly closed her emotions away, lowered the phone, and turned her sharp, cold gaze back toward Gerald Whitlock, because before her stood a man in the ruins of his own making. Whitlock now no longer resembled the dignified prosecutor who had entered the prison yard that morning. His silver-framed glasses sat crooked on the bridge of his nose, his carefully combed blonde hair had fallen into disarray, and in his eyes there burned the desperate look of an animal driven into a corner, with no way out, perhaps because he understood that every path of denial had been sealed shut, that the notebook and the recording in the ring had exposed him nakedly before dozens of cameras. Something inside him finally broke, and he began to speak, not in the shouting voice of resistance anymore, but in a dry, flat, chillingly cold voice, the voice of a man too exhausted from hiding who had now let everything go. He said yes, she had known, that nurse had known everything. And his voice as he spoke those words carried no remorse at all, only the cold bitterness of a calculating man who had lost a game. He confessed that for many years he had lived a perfect double life, one face as the crime-fighting hero praised by the whole country, the other as the man quietly taking enormous payments from a rival gang in the underworld, money paid so that he would close his eyes while their network operated, so that he would steer his investigations away from those who had bought him and aim them directly at anyone who stood in their way. He said, in the voice of a man describing a purely business transaction, that it had been a perfect arrangement. He had built the reputation of an uncompromising warrior by bringing down targets the other gang wanted removed, while pocketing sums large enough to guarantee a life that a public servant's salary could never have reached, not in a lifetime, and for many years. No one had suspected a thing, because who would suspect the very man leading the fight against evil? Then his voice dropped when he spoke of Marisol. He referred to her in a coldly indifferent tone, as if she were only an unexpected variable that had ruined an otherwise flawless equation. He said her wretched little clinic sat right in the middle of the territory his network controlled, that a nobody night shift nurse bandaging the miserable dregs of the city should never have known about matters far beyond her reach. But she had known, he said. She had heard things she shouldn't have heard from the mouths of the people she treated, had seen things she shouldn't have seen, and worst of all, she hadn't had the sense to keep her mouth shut the way anyone wiser would have done, but instead wrote everything down, collected everything, built an entire file against him with that stubborn conscience of hers. He said she had tried to approach him, had warned him that she knew who he truly was and that she wouldn't stay silent, that she was giving him a chance to confess and put an end to the network that was trampling the innocent people she had always protected. And in Whitlock's voice as he recounted this, there flickered a cold contempt, as though he couldn't understand how anyone could be so naive and reckless as to place her own life on the scale for some hollow principle. He said he had considered every option, the way he always considered things, that one accusation from her, even if it was only the word of an unknown nurse, would be enough to bring down the entire double-faced empire he had spent so much effort building, enough to turn the hero of the nation into a criminal overnight. And for a man who had wagered his whole life on that mask, it was a threat that couldn't be tolerated. And so, he said in that dry and chilling voice, he decided that the nurse and her notebook had to disappear, that the problem had to be solved before it could spread, just as he had solved every other obstacle in his path, as if the life of the woman who had saved so many people was nothing more than a line item to be erased from the books in order to preserve his profitable business. But even after those cold confessions about money and calculation had ended, Warden Boyd still felt that something in the story was incomplete, an empty space, a missing piece. And she looked straight at Whitlock and asked that if it had only been because of the notebook and the threat of exposure, then a calculating man like him must have had 100 other ways, colder and cleaner, to silence a witness, so why had he gone to her house himself that night? That question touched something beneath Whitlock's calculating shell, and suddenly the dry, composed voice he had used until now cracked. Something hot and chaotic surged into his eyes, and the words burst out of him no longer like a statement, but like a dam breaking after being held back far too long. He said no, it wasn't only the notebook, that she had been more than a threat that needed to be eliminated, and his voice trembled with a sick bitterness as he confessed that he had noticed Marisol long before she knew anything about his network. He said that during his visits to that neighborhood he had seen her, had become haunted by the gentleness and kindness she gave to everyone, and that the twisted feeling inside him had slowly grown into a hunger to possess her, an urge to claim for himself the light she gave off, the light he felt a powerful man like him deserved to have. He said, his voice distorted by an emotion even he couldn't control, that he had tried to approach her, had offered her everything he had, money, status, a life a poor girl from a slum couldn't even dream of, and that he couldn't accept the fact that she had rejected him, had looked at him not with admiration but with pity mixed with fear, and worst of all, had given her heart to a man who, in his eyes, was nothing but a criminal. On that fateful night, he confessed. He had gone to her house not simply as someone coming to silence a witness, but as a man being burned alive by two obsessions at once, both enraged by the notebook that threatened to destroy him and driven mad by the rejection he couldn't swallow. And he had come to force her to listen to him one last time, to force her to hand over everything and submit to him. But Marisol, even when facing a dangerous man inside her own home, hadn't knelt. She had stood straight and rejected him once more, had told him that she would never stay silent and would never belong to him, and it was that unyielding dignity, that light he both craved and couldn't control, that pushed his rage beyond the final boundary. He said, his voice breaking and evasive, that everything had slipped out of control, that the dog had lunged between them to protect her, that in the violent chaos it had clamped its teeth onto his hand, and he had been forced to fight it off, and that was when the ring on his hand had been bitten and chipped, a broken fragment lodged in the animal's jaw, without his knowing it. And then came the most horrifying part, which he tried to say quickly as if to deny it even as he spoke, that during the struggle Marisol had managed to break free, had rushed out of the house and into the rain-lashed night, had tried to run toward life, but she hadn't made it far, and he had found her collapse not far away. With his cold mind returning even in that terrifying moment, he had realized that if he left her where she had fallen, every trace would lead back to him, and so he had carried her back into the house, had rearranged every detail of the scene with careful and ruthless precision, so that all the evidence would point toward the man who would come home late that night, her lover, the man who already carried a dark past that made the whole city willing to believe he was the killer. He had turned Marisol's own love into the perfect trap to bury both her and the man she loved at the same time. And those final swabs rang out in the yard. The entire place sank into a horrifying silence, because now everyone understood that Marisol Reyes hadn't died as some helpless accidental victim, but had fallen as a person who dared to stand upright until the final second, paying with her life for refusing to bow before evil and for the courage to choose the truth. When Whitlock's voice died out in the yard, a heavy silence fell, and inside that silence Raphael slowly began to speak, his voice hoarse and shattered, as if every word tore something open inside him. For 7 years, Raphael had lived in a silent prison of his own making, carrying the crushing guilt that his dark lifestyle had ultimately brought about Marisol's death. He had accepted his death sentence not as an injustice, but as a form of painful atonement. But now, with the truth fully laid bare, the heavy chains of self-blame finally shattered. He realized that her final actions were not a tragedy of abandonment, but an enduring testament to her love and courage, a final gift that completely freed his soul from the darkness that had consumed him for so long. When Raphael understood that, his whole body folded down, both hands braced against the cold concrete, and from deep inside his chest came a sob like the cry of a wounded animal. Then, through the tears streaming down his face, he said something, softly but clearly enough to cut through the stillness of the prison yard, that she hadn't given up, that until her final breath she had still been trying to save everyone, including him. And then he said one more sentence, a sentence he had never spoken to anyone in all those 7 years, making Danny, who had been standing silently nearby, suddenly jerk around and stare at him with wide, astonished eyes, because the words that had just left the mouth of the man he had hated for so many years had touched something he himself was still hiding deep in his heart. While the last pieces of truth were still settling over the yard, the convoy of proper authorities arrived, and federal agents, together with officials from the Attorney General's office, came through the gate with decisive steps, moving straight toward Gerald Whitlock. The prosecutor, who had once stood as the symbol of an entire justice system, now stood there weakened and hollow, and when the steel handcuffs closed around his wrists, around the very wrist still marked by the dog's teeth, and wearing the chipped signet ring that had betrayed him, no more threats came out of his mouth, only the empty stare of a man who had just watched the entire empire of lies he had built over a lifetime collapse in a single morning. The reporters he himself had invited there to record his moment of glory now crowded around to capture the moment he was led away. The same lenses that had once raised him up as a hero, now coldly taking in the sight of the mask falling, and he was escorted out of the yard through a silence heavier than any jeering could have been, the silence of people who had just realized they had trusted the wrong man for so many years. But while every eye was still following the figure of the prosecutor being taken away, Danny Reyes suddenly collapsed where he stood, his shoulders shaking, and from inside him came something he had carried into the prison yard that morning as a final secret no one knew. He said, his voice choking and breaking, that he hadn't come here today to witness an execution, that this was only what he had said so he would be allowed to be present. And the truth was that he had carried a silent, desperate vow into the prison yard that morning. He confessed through his tears that the guilt of surviving had broken him completely, and he had planned to end his own life once the execution was carried out, believing he no longer deserved to live. But the morning had rewritten their destinies. He now knew his sister fell because of her own unyielding courage, not because of his past failures, lifting a stone from his shoulders he thought he would carry to the grave. Sensing the young man's profound release, Raphael dragged himself to Danny's side, placing a grounding hand on his shoulder. In a voice raspy from the brink of death, Raphael told him that Marisol's legacy was one of salvation, not destruction, and she would never want her brother to wander back into the dark. He acknowledged that they had both been captive to the same tragic night, bound by different threads of the same sorrow. But with the truth finally spoken, it was time for both of them to lay their burdens down, not so they could forget her, but so they could keep living in the way she had always hoped they would. Warden Boyd, standing quietly nearby as she witnessed it all, gave a small signal for the prison medical staff to come to Danny's side, not as one might escort away a troubled man, but as one might support a human being who had just been saved from the edge of an abyss, and she told him with a rare gentleness hidden beneath her stern exterior, that he had carried a precious piece of truth inside him for all these years, that his testimony today had helped return justice to his sister, and that this world still needed people who knew how to hold on to the truth the way he had. And in that freezing prison yard, for the first time in 7 years, Danny Reyes lifted his head and felt, fragile but real, a small ray of light from a future he had believed he had lost, the future his sister, through her death and through the final truth she left behind, had just opened for him again. The legal procedures afterward moved at a speed Raphael himself could hardly feel, because under the weight of the fully recorded confession, the notebook, the recording, the chipped ring, and the buried call log that had just been unearthed, there was no longer any obstacle that could keep him behind bars for even 1 more hour. Officials from the Department of Justice, in the presence of federal agents and before dozens of cameras, still broadcasting every moment, moved forward with an emergency release order, a document immediately suspending the sentence and returning freedom to a man the system had wrongfully imprisoned for 7 years, along with a pledge that a full process of restoring his honor would be carried out to clear his name of the crime he had never committed. When the last restraints were removed and Raphael was told he was free, he stood motionless for a long while, as if he didn't dare believe what he had just heard, because for 7 years the word freedom had become a concept so distant that he had almost forgotten what it felt like, and now, when it was suddenly handed back to him, he felt both overwhelmed and hollow, like a man pulled up from beneath the water, after he had already stopped struggling. Warden Eleanor Boyd personally escorted him to the gate, and on that short walk across the yard, the stern woman who had spent the whole morning holding on to an iron composure suddenly slowed her steps, then stopped completely, and she turned to look straight into his eyes with something very different in her gaze. She told, in the plain, unadorned voice of an old soldier, that she owed him a word, that for all 7 years he had been inside the walls she commanded. She had seen him through the very label the whole world had placed on him, had believed with certainty that he was the monster the press described, and not once had she allowed herself to think otherwise. She admitted that she herself, a person who had always taken pride in her ability to read people after 30 years behind bars, had let prejudice cloud her eyes, had judged a human being not by what she had seen with her own eyes, but by what others told her she should believe, and that this morning had taught her a late lesson she would carry to the end of her life, that the label society puts on a person has never been the whole truth of who that person is. She said she had seen the way he called his dog's name early that morning. had sensed something that didn't fit with the image of a monster from that very moment, and that she should have trusted her instincts sooner instead of trusting the file. Raphael listened to those words and only nodded faintly, because he understood that for someone like Boyd, speaking an admission of being wrong was already a rare act of courage, and he didn't need her to say anything more. Then she held out her hand, and he took it, a simple handshake between two people who had just passed together through a morning that had changed everything, and in that grip there was more than any words could express. When the great gate of Rimfield groaned open before him, revealing the silvery gray November sky and the road stretching toward the city, Raphael stepped across that threshold with slow, trembling steps, drawing into his chest the first breath of a free man after 7 years. The salt-tinged air of the sea now carrying a completely different taste. The taste of life returned to him when he no longer dared hope for it. And beside him, never leaving him by half a step, was Duke, the old dog with ash-colored fur and a limping leg, dragging each step with effort, yet still holding its gray head high, walking close to the man it had just saved from death with a loyal memory preserved through 7 long years. Those two survivors, one man and one animal, walked together out from the darkness of the stone walls beneath the gaze of the cameras, and of Warden Boyd standing silently at the gate, slowly moving toward the dim light of a new day, carrying with them a grief that had never faded, but also carrying a truth that had finally been laid bare, and a road ahead that now, for the first time in all those years, belonged to him. In the quiet days after Raphael walked out through the gates of Rimfield, as he slowly grew accustomed again to a world that had changed far too much during the 7 years of his absence, there was one thing that kept returning to his mind each time. He looked at the old dog curled beneath his feet, a question he had never allowed himself to stop and think about all those years, and that was why Duke, among all people and all memories, had remembered and hated one single face with such certainty for so long. And when he sat beside Danny during the first awkward conversations between two people who had once stood on opposite shores of the same grief, Marisol's younger brother told him something Raphael himself had never fully known. A piece of the story about the dog he had long believed was his alone, because Duke had never truly been Raphael's dog from the beginning. It was Marisol's dog, and more than that, it was a living creature her own healing hands had saved. Danny said that many years earlier, on a rainy, windswept evening, someone had abandoned an injured dog near the clinic door where his sister worked, a broken and exhausted animal abused and rejected by life, a dog anyone else would have turned away from because it looked as though almost no hope remained. But Marisol hadn't. She had knelt beside it right there in the rain, had carried it inside, and with the same gentle devotion she gave to the most suffering human beings, she had cared for it through long nights, had bandaged the wounds on its body, had patiently fed it little by little until life slowly returned to its brown eyes, and she had given it the name Duke. That dog, pulled back from the threshold of death by her compassion, became bound to her with the absolute loyalty only creatures that have been saved can understand. It followed her everywhere, lay waiting for her outside the clinic through her night shifts, and in its simple heart, she was the whole world, the first hand in its life that had treated it with love instead of cruelty. And when Marisol entered Raphael's life, when the love between two people who seemed to belong to two different worlds slowly grew, she brought Duke to him, gave him the dog not as an ordinary gift, but as a piece of herself, and only now did Raphael understand that the living creature she had placed in his hands was the breathing embodiment of everything she believed, that every life was worth saving, that kindness could pull anyone back from the darkness. That was why, on that fateful night, Duke had been with her and not with him, because it was always with her, and when danger came, it hadn't hesitated to throw itself between her and the cruel man to protect the person who had given it a second life. It had fought with everything an animal could have, had carried the wounds on its body, and had held in its teeth the piece of evidence it never truly let go of for 7 years. The loyalty Duke carried all its life had never truly belonged to Raphael. It was the legacy of the love Marisol had planted in that animal, and through the long 7 years while Raphael wasted away behind bars, the old dog had silently carried inside its ruined body a memory of the woman who had saved it, and of the man who had taken her away, waiting for a day, however fragile the hope, to reclaim justice for her. When he understood that, Raphael sat in silence for a very long time beside the dog, his hand gently stroking its gray head, and he realized that Duke was the last and most precious piece of Marisol left in this world, a living keepsake that could breathe, feel pain and love, carrying within it the very spirit of her, and that through 7 years when he had believed he had lost her completely, a part of her had in fact always been there, curled beneath his feet, loyal and enduring. And then, while sorting through the old keepsakes Danny had preserved from his sister to give back to him, among papers and small objects stained by time, Raphael found a yellowed envelope, a letter written in Marisol's familiar hand that she had written but never had the chance to send. And as his trembling fingers traced the name she had written on the front of the envelope, he understood that he was about to hear her voice, one final time, from the other side of 7 years and from beyond death itself. The cemetery lay on a gentle slope facing the sea, and on that November afternoon, Raphael and Danny walked together through the silent rows of stone markers, two people who had once stood on opposite shores of the same loss now moving side by side without a word, and between them, slow on its limping leg, walked Duke. They stopped before a simple gray headstone carved with the name Marisol Reyes, and the brief numbers that marked a life cut off far too soon. And for a long while, no one said anything at all. There was only the sea wind moving through the bare branches and the distant sound of waves rising from far away. Raphael knelt on the damp grass, placed a bouquet of white flowers at the foot of the grave, then drew from inside his coat the yellowed letter, the envelope bearing her handwriting, the letter she had written but never had the chance to send, and with trembling hands he opened it beneath the pale afternoon light. Marisol's words appeared before his eyes, and as he read them, her voice seemed to come alive from the other side of 7 years, and from beyond death itself, gentle and warm exactly as he had always remembered. In that letter she wrote of her love for him, a love that wasn't blind to who he truly was, but saw both the darkness and the light inside him and still chose to believe in the good. She wrote that what she wanted more than anything in the world wasn't the money or the safety he could give her, but a day when he would be brave enough to walk away from the dark world that had bound him for so long, to leave behind the underground empire and the prices it demanded, so that the two of them could live a simple and honest life together. She wrote that she believed he could do it, that she saw in him a decent man buried beneath the shell circumstance had placed over him, and that she would wait, patiently and without a single word of pressure, until the day he chose the light for himself. When he reached those final lines, Raphael bowed his head, and tears fell silently onto the grass, because he remembered that he had once promised her, had once said that after this deal, after this one last time, he would stop, would leave everything behind and come to her. And that promise had remained suspended forever, unfinished, because she had been taken from him before he could keep it. He placed his hand on the cold headstone, and in a soft voice meant only for her to hear, he said he was sorry for making her wait so long, that he knew he was 7 years late, but he would keep his word. This time he would keep his word, that the world that had stolen her from him would no longer be his world. Beside him, Danny stood in silence with tears running down his face, and then he knelt beside the man he had once hated, and in that quiet moment, two people who had both loved the woman who was gone, found in each other a forgiveness that didn't need to be spoken aloud, a reconciliation born from the very grief they had each carried alone for so many years. And while the two men knelt there, Duke slowly moved forward. The old dog sniffed at the headstone, circled it once, then slowly lowered itself down right in front of the grave, resting its gray head on its front paws, and it refused to leave. Raphael softly called its name, but the dog only lifted its brown eyes to look at him for a moment, then turned back toward the headstone, lying still with a quiet patience, as if it were still waiting for the woman who had saved it to step out from somewhere. As if with its simple loyal heart, it knew better than anyone that this was where she was. Looking at the dog lying guard beside that grave, Raphael suddenly understood something, that he had no right to pull Duke away from the person it had belonged to all its life. And a quiet decision formed in his heart that he would find a way for the dog to stay close to her, so it would never again have to be far from the woman who had given it a life, and so that he himself, returning to this place every day, could be with both of them, the woman he loved and the loyal dog that had preserved her memory even longer than he had. Evening slowly fell over the seaside cemetery. the wind blowing the last leaves across the grass, and those 3 surviving souls remained beside the grave in the sunset, no longer separated by hatred or misunderstanding or stone walls, with only the stillness of hearts that had finally found their way back to one another. In the spring of the following year, on the very poor street where Marisol Reyes had lived and given her whole life, a new community clinic opened its doors again, brighter and warmer than before, and on the sign hanging out front, her name was engraved in solemn lettering, the Marisol Reyes Clinic, so that anyone who crossed that threshold would know this place had been built in memory of a woman who believed every life deserved to be protected. Rafael Castellano had kept his belated promise. He had quietly untied, one strand at a time, every bond that still connected him to the underworld that had held him captive for so many years, had turned his back on power and on money stained with darkness, and had used his own fortune to bring back to life the place where the woman he loved had spent so many sleepless nights, healing the people the whole city had forgotten. He was no longer the boss the country had once feared, nor was he the condemned man the press had once cursed. Now he was only a quiet man who opened the clinic door every morning, a human being learning how to live honestly again, in exactly the way Marisol had always believed he could. Danny Reyes worked beside him, and the young man who had once stood at the edge of despair had now found his purpose again by continuing the unfinished work of his sister. He learned how to care for patients, how to comfort people in pain, and in every small thing he did each day, there seemed to be the shadow of the sister who had saved him, as if the love she had once given him was now flowing on through his hands to others. Rafael had given Danny the very second road Marisol had once given him, a chance to begin again, a home, and a reason to wake each morning, and in the quiet bond between those 2 men, something had been repaired, a shared wound that had finally healed into strength. And out in the clinic lobby, where the morning sunlight spread across a wide porch, Duke lay warming himself on the warm tile floor, the old dog with ash-colored fur, now having a peaceful place to rest after a lifetime of loyalty. And the neighborhood children came every day, gathering around him, giggling as they stroked his silver head, running happily around the lobby while their clear laughter rang everywhere, and the dog only wagged its old tail softly, gently letting the children sit beside him, happy in the warmth of those small lives and in the light this place had been born to preserve. Duke was taken to rest beside Marisol's grave every weekend, so that loyal creature could be near the woman who had given it a life, and Rafael believed that somehow she knew, that she was smiling down at the place that carried her name, down at her brother standing strong again, down at the man she loved finally stepping into the light, and down at the small dog she had once saved, now being loved by children. Their story, if it leaves anything behind for those who listen, is perhaps a reminder that a person should never be defined only by the label society rushes to place on them, that beneath the shell the world believes to be the whole truth, there may still be a heart capable of love and a soul worth saving, that a poor nurse can be the light of an entire neighborhood, while a man praised by the whole country can hide the deepest darkness, and that the dignity of a human being lies in what they choose to do, not in their status or their past. That story also reminds us that loyalty and truth are never truly lost. They may be buried, forgotten, mislabeled for 7 long years, but they still wait patiently in a faithful heart until the day they can speak, and that justice and healing sometimes come from the place we least expect, from the enduring memory of an animal, from the courage of one small woman, from the truth finally finding its way home. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so we can listen together to many more meaningful stories each day. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story, so please leave a comment sharing the thoughts from deep inside your heart, so we can listen and understand with you. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very end. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, calm, and daily serenity. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.